things that they like to do that they don't do anymore. Things that people used to be excited about but are not excited about anymore. Those can be signs of distress that you can look out for, not necessarily warning signs of suicide. But when we're talking about warning signs, we're looking at distress basically. So if you're able to identify any distress and intervene at that point, maybe it will not then reach to a point of suicide.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to PsychTalks. I am Payal Borova. I'll be your tonight's host for this session, Youth Advocacy in Suicide Prevention. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death among young people in South Asia, where the region accounts for nearly 40% of the world's suicides. At PsychTalks, we believe that mental health conversations shouldn't be a privilege, especially in communities where they are too often neglected. We are building a space where psychology meets purpose, helping people reconnect with themselves. In this spirit, we are honored to welcome Aneeqa Khalid, a mental health professional from Kashmir who leads the mental health advocacy project at ICPP. With her extensive experience in designing youth trainings, leading workshops, and pioneering innovative approaches. Hello, Aneeqa, how are you?
Hi, Payal. Thank you for introducing me. I'm quite well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much, Anika, for joining us today. It's an honor to have you with us, and we are really looking forward to hearing your journey and insights. So, let's begin with our first question to you: that what inspired you to focus on youth advocacy in suicide prevention, and how did your journey begin?
All right. Thank you, Payal. I don't think my journey was quite straightforward when going into suicide prevention. I was always inclined towards youth advocacy and mental health. But I think I delved into suicide prevention after looking at going back to my personal experiences in college. Um, and I think witnessing suicides in the campus. So I think that is something that sort of prompted me towards working on suicide prevention, that acted as a motivating factor. And also trying to understand, because when you look at somebody, when you see somebody who's so close to you, who's in the same classroom as you, prompted to do something so grave, and then you're forced to see the reality and ask difficult questions about why this is happening, especially with young people. And what I came across were a lot of obviously systemic factors. And then, as an individual who was studying psychology, I did not know how in a clinic you can intervene for a problem that is structural in nature. Which is why I sort of lean towards youth advocacy and obviously suicide prevention being a part of it. That's where I started working first. Yeah, that's about it for my journey. And if I have to answer where did my journey begin, it actually began with working on a fellowship, which was actually called Youth Advocacy for Suicide Prevention, at an organization in Pune, in India, where I was mentoring a group of 10 young fellows from 5 different cities in India who were being trained in doing advocacy in their communities. And basically, I was teaching them policy advocacy. So, how do you connect mental health issues and make them into policy issues? And how do you then connect the structural determinants of health, mental health that we were just talking about? How do you bring the system to the individual? Is what we were trying to do. So these fellows were asked to look at issues in the community that are related to suicides that are happening. So, for example, if you look at the largest example that I can think of is farmer suicide in India, something that everyone must have heard about. So the farmer suicide in India, why are they happening? The major factor are the policies, the agricultural policies of the state, right? And you cannot stop the suicides until you do something about the policy. So the idea of the fellowship was for the young people to be trained so that they're able to recognize these gaps in policy and become a bridge between their community and policymakers. And that's where I started my journey of working in youth suicide prevention.
Thank you for sharing your story, Aneeqa. That's truly inspiring, and it's powerful to hear how your journey has shaped your passion for this work. Now, building on that experience, I'm moving to our next question. What are some of the most common mental health challenges faced by young people in Southeast Asia, from your perspective?
As I was already talking about structural determinants of health and basically looking at a systemic lens to look at suicide, when you're looking at South Asia, especially, and young people, um, you quoted some statistics as well. Actually, it's very sad to see the growing number of suicides amongst young people. And the main factor, or one of the main reasons, is unemployment. It is pressures on education. It is sometimes, a lot of times, what you hear in narratives when people are talking about, especially when media is talking about suicides, there's a lot of sensationalization of suicides and a lot of talk of how the Gen Z is more prone towards, is not resilient and more prone towards suicides because of relationship issues. But that's not the case. If you look at the statistics, it is the systemic gaps that are there, the barriers that are there in place, whether it's caste, whether it's class, whether it's gendered. And obviously, when you're talking about all of these things, then education, domestic violence, gendered violence, for that matter, comes into being. Um, so these are some, and one of the major challenges is an unemployment and pressures due to study. Sometimes there's family conflict, right? And in South Asian cultures, especially, communities are close knit. Families are tight, cultures are tight, right? And living in a South Asian country, and also which is sort of developing, also modernizing and trying to adopt into a Western framework of what quote unquote modernity looks like, becomes very difficult for a young person to cope up with. And within that, there are no conversations on mental health because of the stigma around mental health and the idea that it is an individual issue. There are very few spaces where a person can go and talk about these things. A lot of times, what happens is, even if you want to talk about something, because of the cultures that you've been brought up in, there's a lot of shame around certain topics. Uh, and a lot of times, like something simple as, hey, I failed my exam. And every time that you hear about 10th class results, 12th class results, I'm talking in the context of India here, or those entrance exams which qualify you for IITs or NEET exams, you hear about a lot of suicide, like growing rates of suicides, right? Especially amongst young people. So what is happening here is that there are pressures on the young people to be able to get into an education system which is not able to accommodate the youth in the first place, right? Um, so if we're talking about human rights or we're talking about equal opportunity, there isn't equal opportunity in the first place. You don't have enough institutions to be able to accommodate the growing population, young population in your country. And which is why there are so many pressures on that young person to then obviously qualify an exam to be able to get that one seat to be able to pursue education, right? Like imagine, when you talk about human rights, right to education is a basic right. Even if you don't talk about human rights, I'm sure it's in all of the constitutions: right to education, right to health. But do we have access to education? Do we have access to proper healthcare? We don't. um, and these becomes like major challenges. Rather than looking at it as an individual problem, we need to be able to look at it from a larger holistic perspective, which looks at the system that the individual is born and brought up into, and at each phase of their life, what sort of barriers are they coming across, and how does this then shape their mental health in that case.
Yeah, thank you. That really highlights the struggles young people are carrying in this region. Same goes for Bangladesh. Also, we see a lot of problem related to that. Um, and one of the biggest barriers you touched on is stigma. So, suicide is often surrounded by stigma and silence. In that context, how can communities create safe spaces for young people to speak about their struggles?
Thank you for bringing that up. Combating stigma is not easy, especially for individuals, right? Especially for young people. But how can you, since you talked about creating safe spaces, it's, I would suggest that as people who are from South Asian cultures, we often forget our roots. So we need to go back to our roots and see what are some of the community practices that existed, gathering practices that existed and do not exist anymore, for example, right? Or maybe as a young generation, we've lost touch with that physical gathering spaces, right? So, for example, in the case of Kashmir, um, gatherings in shrines is a very common sight for women, and that in itself, if you look at the spaces that already exist in the community, right, spaces that are accepted by the community, how do you bring dialogue there would be easier than me trying to create a space in my office and being like, hey, people, come here, let's talk about this. It's more difficult to break stigma, and it's um you're not really reaching out to the community then. So what you need to do as an organization, or as people who want to talk about, want to break the stigma or want to contribute towards um, creating awareness on mental health and suicide prevention, we need to enter these spaces and we need to be able to have conversations in these spaces and have conversations in our families as well. And how do you create these? You first disrupt, interrupt spaces that are already existing. You also try to create alternative spaces. I'm not saying that you stick to what already exists. Also try to create alternate spaces where you invite young people to have a dialogue. That can be through storytelling, have just a workshop on storytelling, have um, anonymous you can have a meeting online, just have a meeting online you have a platform, right? Have a meeting online with young people who are willing to just talk about their experiences, and they can be anonymous. They don't have to turn on their cameras, they don't have to name themselves. They can just open up and talk about their experiences with mental health issues or suicide, right? It's often very difficult to come out with your own stories, um, and sometimes what also helps is you become an advocate uh, for other people by sharing your own story. So, for example, for myself, um, have I ever had thoughts of suicide? Yes, definitely, I have. So, if, for example, I can share that on a public platform and be open about it, maybe it will give 10 more people the courage to be able to do that. And it's often stigmatized, like, you've had so much access to things in life, why would you come to such a point? Every now and then people are surrounded by certain things, structures that put barriers in front of them, which force them into such a place. So I think what we need to do is openly, first, as young people who want to reduce stigma, talk about your own stories, encourage your friends to talk about their own stories, go back to your roots, your community spaces, become a part of those spaces on your community's trust. And that's how you can, bring in your narrative, your perspective on mental health and suicide prevention, and how you can also create awareness in the community by going out to the community and also creating alternative spaces where people can gather, talk, share stories, experiences. Along with that, obviously, there are larger initiatives that you can do. When you're talking about advocacy, it can be a large plan that you design, Um, you think about concrete steps that you want to achieve in your advocacy plan. Like I was talking about the fellowship that we were doing, that I was leading. You basically design and you identify an issue and you work on that then. So for this, this is an issue and I want to, for example, do an awareness camp. Um, I want to reach out to the doctors and have a training for them, call a professional and have a training for them so that they understand how important it is for mental health professionals to talk about suicide prevention, especially in the language that people will understand. Um, especially because we're talking about South Asia, our cultures may not understand it in the same way or in the same language that psychology or mental health discipline in a way does, right? So always when we're thinking about creating spaces, we always need to think about how do we decolonize, how do we contextualize. So yeah.
Yeah, that's such an important point you have portrayed. Safe spaces can be really life changing. So thank you for emphasizing on that. Speaking of safety, it's also crucial to recognize risk early on. So my next question to you would be that what are some early warning signs that our friends, teachers, or family members should look out for in someone at risk of suicide?
um okay, just to first come to warning signs. uh Sometimes, a lot of times, people think that suicides are spontaneous, but most of the times they're actually well thought out and well planned. Spontaneous is very rare. Um, Even a student who, sort of um, dies by suicide has thought about it before the exam, that they knew if they were going to fail, they might be doing this, right? So what you can look out for is whether that person is, for example, joking about ending their lives, first of all. If they constantly keep mentioning, um, it would be better if the world would, end. Or in a laugh passing by, they would say that it'd be better if I would die tomorrow. The world would be a better place, or something like that. Those are like some things that you can pick up in their vocabulary. Things that they like to do that they don't do anymore. Things that people used to be excited about but are not excited about anymore. Those can be signs of distress that you can look out for, not necessarily warning signs of suicide. But when we're talking about warning signs, we're looking at distress, basically. So if you're able to identify any distress and intervene at that point, maybe it will not then reach to a point of suicide. So any form of functionality that you think is affected, their appetite is affected, they're not eating, their mood fluctuates a lot, they're not going out, and sometimes it will be very difficult to even though I'm outlining all of these warning signs, sometimes it's difficult to even see all of this, or sometimes all of this might not even be present. So I think it's important to just check in with each other now and then and ask how you are doing. Just a simple question like that maybe um, will provide a listening ear to someone who is in distress or who's not able to bring up a difficult conversation. And I think what is more important in that phase is also not minimizing somebody's problems. Sometimes when somebody starts sharing something with you, you say, hey, it's going to be okay. People are dealing with a lot worse. Um, so just being very careful about the language that you're using, because you never know what people are going through. Um, and yeah, you might regret later on saying what you said, and yeah, affecting the person in a way that you didn't intend to. So yeah, I think early warning signs, language, mood, levels of functionality, distress, all of that are basic warning signs to be looking out for. Or if the person is clearly very overwhelmed, is having panic attacks, anxiety issues, all of that can be some things to look out for.
Okay, so that's very practical and helpful. You talked about decolonization. We also have a heavy Western influence in academic psychology. So, how important is cultural relevancy in mental health discussions?
I cannot emphasize this enough, that psychology as a discipline came from a colonial legacy, right? Um, it started with sort of providing care to war veterans. Um, so it's designed in a way to be able to, address an individual problem. Even when psychology was trying to help the war veterans, it was trying to help the war veterans' individual impact, not that, hey, this person was in a war, and that's what is affecting their well-being. Um, So it's important to always be aware of that as a practitioner, as a student of psychology. And then, again, as I said, go back to your own roots, and people will have answers for you. Your own community practices will have answers for you. That's how you can begin decolonizing, first of all, and also doing away with the language that you're taught, because the language of psychology in itself is individualizing. What I have found helpful in my own practice is um, going back to community practices, going back to what we used to do or the language that we use for mental health, for example. So for distress in Kashmiri, there's just a word that everybody uses when they're distressed is tension, right? What is one word that your community will recognize? How do you decolonize your subject for them? Actually, for yourself. How do you decolonize psychology and sort of embed yourself in your own culture, in your own roots, and bring that in your practice? And I think one of the ways that um, now I'm working at the International Center for Peace Psychology in Kashmir. So one of the ways that I'm doing that there is also, as I think we were talking about mental health hikes before, is going back, because Kashmir, as you know, often called a heaven on earth, but has seen a lot of conflict, right, over the past 7 decades now, over 7 decades now. But what is one thing that is still easily accessible to us is nature. And how do you integrate that then in your practice? How do you integrate and go back, integrate ecology and sort of your connection as a human being to nature? Um, and also, because Kashmir is a predominantly Muslim state, it's easier for you to go back to nature, see where you came from. So it's believed that um, you were Adam was made from mud, right? So it's easier to like sort of relate to ground yourself in the soil, in look at what has been created, and how do you then ground yourself in your own ecology, bring yourself back to your own land, because the question of land in itself, when we're talking about conflict, becomes very important, right? So how do we hold on to our own identity, and design, practices that encourage this reflective practice, that encourage talking about your own roots, because um, in conflict zones, often those spaces diminish where you can go back to your own identity, reflect on your own identity, and talk about that. So I think that's a very important practice of care and well-being, where you're able to reflect on who you are, where you came from, and where you want to go with this. A lot of times, what happens is we lose ourselves in the day to day. And again, for South Asian cultures, I would definitely say look back in your own cultural practices, look back in at your own homes, how you used to be, whether it's just the practice of eating lunch together or having dinner together or just gathering for festivals. Those spaces become really important uh, for your own well-being.
Yeah. So, yes, we do feel the Kashmiri struggle. And being aware in that context, like being aware of the science is something we can apply in our daily life. So, along with awarenesses, initiatives approaches also make a difference. You have designed a unique initiative like mental health hikes, which I'm really impressed of, that combine ecology, spirituality, and psychology. So, how do these approaches help reduce stress and build resilience in youth?
As I was just talking about the mental health hikes, so the idea is to integrate ecology, psychology, and spirituality. And how we do that is the workshops are designed as such that we invite young people to register for a workshop, take them on a hike, uh, whichever is close by. The hikes were more aimed at women because the outdoor spaces are less accessible to women often, whether it's the fear of going in the forest or being with too many men outside. So if it's a woman leading, it's easier. If the timings are, matching the cultural relevance of when a woman is supposed to be out and when they want to go back home, by what time. So those are like small things that you need to consider, especially when you were talking about decolonizing and contextualizing. You cannot have a session at a time when you know these people won't not will. This is the demographic that I'm losing out on if I'm keeping the timing of the session as such, right? So these are the things that you need to be very mindful of when designing something. So the idea is people go on a hike, and then in the middle of the hike, we have a 1-2 hour long break where we usually have themed sessions around faith, food, our own culture, identity, uh, or whether it's pressing issues that are coming up, whether it was the genocide happening in Palestine, whether it was the floods in Kashmir, or the global climate crisis. So the idea is for people to have some recourse to be able to um, connect to what is happening in their own bodies, while at the same time connecting to the ecology around them and sort of ground them. So that's like embedding a practice of well-being within a process of, you know, analyzing or talking about like difficult situations. How do you keep yourself grounded? And always bring in for me personally, uh, my faith is connected to a lot to the land and the earth, where we come from and where we go back, as a Muslim. So for me, it's always important to bring that into perspective. And I think through the mental health hikes, the that's the kind of learning, or that's the kind of takeaway that I want people to go with, that they feel more connected to themselves. And I think if you connect just a little bit to where you are, um, that sort of grounds you to yourself. And oftentimes, um, it's laughable actually. The techniques that we're taught as psychology students, whether it's box breathing or it's basic grounding techniques. What is the basic grounding technique look like? Uh, 5 things you smell, 5 things you hear, 5 things you can touch around yourself, right? What is that basically? It is basically coming back to your present self. And I think that that can be practiced very well when you're out in nature, and you don't really need the 5 prompts for that. Um, and Obviously, accessibility to nature is a privilege, which we're utilizing through these initiatives. Um, yeah, and just to sort of bring back, certain or reflect on certain practices that we're losing out on, whether it's just things as simple as not eating with our hands anymore, not feeling our food anymore, not being able to feel the texture of the food anymore. Is that why you're not as connected to where your food is coming from? That these are larger questions that we don't think about often. Um, and slowly our practices are changing in the modern world. Um, so I think it's important to create those spaces where you have those moments to at least go back and look at the chain through which we are all connected, whether it's food, whether it's where it's coming from, where it's going, and how it's coming out, like things as simple as that, or where the waste is even going after you're doing this. I don't think we think about this on a daily basis. So, yeah.